Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the Redistricting 101 webinar. My name is James Collins. I'm the Senior Director of Business Development at CSBA, and I will be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I want to take a few moments to announce a few quick announcements. If at any time you have a question for presenters or technical issues, please use the questions tab of your GoToWebinar dashboard. If you do not see the webinar dashboard, it may be collapsed. Look for an orange arrow in the top right corner of your screen. Click on the arrow and it will expand the dashboard. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters for today's discussion, Robert Terrick, CSBA's Chief Legal Counsel, and Paul Mitchell, founder of Redistricting Partners. Redistricting Partners is a full-service firm handling decennial redistricting, conversation to districts under the California Voting Rights Act, and racially polarized voting analysis. Redistricting Partners has conducted the redistricting for more than 35 cities, school boards, and community college districts.
Thank you, James, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining our webinar today. We're here to talk about trustee areas, district elections, and voting methods. Under California Education Code, there are 3 different ways in which you can elect your board members. Those are trustee areas, in which you have individual trustees assigned to trustee areas within the district, and those trustees are elected from members of the public within each of those districts. And then there is also the at-large method, in which the district as a whole votes for all of the board members at your district. And then under the Education Code, there's a hybrid method, which allows you to sort of combine those, in which you would have trustee areas from which the board members are elected, but the elections are actually done on a district-wide basis. So the Education Code, really, it gives you the authority both to choose from amongst these voting methods and also to define and establish your trustee areas. It's really important to understand that if you've got that first method, if you use trustee area voting, in the year following the federal census, the release of the data from the federal census, you are required to revisit your trustee areas to make sure that your boundaries are drawn appropriately. For the other 2 methods, even though they're defined in Education Code separately, it's important to know that the California Voting Rights Act defines them similarly. They're kind of lumped together within that act. And that's important because the California Voting Rights Act can potentially expose your district to liability. If there's evidence of racially polarized voting, then the act allows for citizen suit enforcement of the act, and with attorney's fees provisions, that means that you could be sued and potentially be exposed to significant legal costs. For small school districts, in particular small rural school districts, this poses another unique challenge, in the sense that the Voting Rights Act could expose you to potential liability if you continue to use trustee or at-large elections. But on the other hand, if you switch to trustee voting areas as a small district, that could potentially limit your pool of candidates. So there's a lot of thought and consideration that needs to go into this process. And to help you out with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Paul Mitchell, founder of our CSBA business affiliate, Redistricting Partners, and he can go into more detail.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I believe you can see my monitor too. And if that's the case, please somebody let me know if that isn't what is showing, and otherwise I'll just start going through this presentation. Thanks for having me. Redistricting Partners is a firm, as was mentioned, that works in redistricting, California Voting Rights Act, and work in racially polarized voting, and we're working with a number of jurisdictions this redistricting cycle. I'm going to go through a number of kind of basic overview points, things that you're going to need to know about the process as you engage in this decennial redistricting, or potentially go through a process of converting under the California Voting Rights Act. So it all starts with the census. I'll go through a presentation to go through some of the what we know about the census so far, the California Voting Rights Act, the differences between districting, redistricting, and what gerrymandering is, the use of traditional redistricting principles in order to ensure that a redistricting is not a gerrymander. I'll go through some of the principles of the Fair Maps Act, which is new state law and gives a real best practices for school districts that are doing redistricting. And then I'll go through some timeline suggestions for agencies that are having to go through either a CVRA conversion or a districting. So first off, the census this last year, the 2020 census is designed to count where every person lives, where they rest their head at night on April 1st, 2020. It's supposed to be a point in time survey. Obviously, it happens over the course of months. And this cycle's process was different than any other we'd had. The first way in which it was different is that it introduced this online component. People could fill out the census on a website. That's something that was brand new. It really wasn't tested thoroughly. It was supposed to have 4 tests. It only had 1 test in Rhode Island of all places. And we met with the Census Department there, and it's just to keep it simple, the Rhode Island's a little different than California. So there was real concern about the use of this online system and how it would work with a state like California with its diversity, lack of broadband in certain areas, and other issues, particularly in the traditionally hard to count areas. There was a major issue around the citizenship question. And in fact, that issue continued through until just last month. But there was 3 elements to that. One was whether or not they would have a question on the census that asks citizenship. That was thrown out by the Supreme Court, but still a lot of Americans believed it was on there. So there was still some lingering fear about the census based on a belief that that question was still being used on the census and might be used against somebody who was not a citizen. The second element was whether or not they would remove non-citizens by using administrative records, remove them from the apportionment for each state to determine the number of congressional districts in each state. Then the third thing was that they were going to be putting citizenship data into the final redistricting census data set, which would allow some states to do their redistricting not based on the total count of people, but based on the total count of citizens. So I'll get into that a little bit more, but suffice it to say, all 3 of those things have been removed, and the census that's coming out won't have any of those elements. The third thing, and potentially the largest thing, was the delays due to COVID. The biggest delay being the in-person canvass, the counting that traditionally is door to door, that used to form the heart of the census process, but this cycle ended up getting extended, delayed, and so there was a lot of concern about the how well that was done, and making sure that they were balancing the need to have a census done by a certain time with the need to be able to do it effectively in this environment. So the census data is required to be released, different data products in different sets. So the redistricting data set is supposed to be out by March 31st. This is the first time in a long time that the Census Bureau has missed this deadline. In addition to the redistricting file, there are other data products they have to release that are actually on time. So the geography, in a GIS sense, it's the shapes of each census block. That data set has been released on time. The American Community Survey, which is a rolling 5-year average survey that looks at deeper questions. It used to be called the long form of the US Census, but it looks at things like socioeconomic factors and race and ethnicity and citizenship. that data set has come out on time. So some of this data is actually in our hands and actually can be used already. It's that decennial census file that is not yet done. The California Voting Rights Act is the first thing I'll cover, and a lot of districts probably have heard of this. Many probably have already gone through this process, so sorry for repeating something that you're probably really familiar with. But the California Voting Rights Act only speaks to at-large agencies that need to convert to districted election systems. It defines at-large different than the Education Code defines it, but it defines it as any agency that doesn't have single-member districts where only the residents from that district elect their school board member. It also has a definition for racially polarized voting. Now, I'm not giving legal advice, but just to kind of understand the differences in the law in California and federally. Federally, racially polarized voting both is the difference in voting patterns between people based on their race or ethnicity, and the impact that it has on elections, and the idea that there's a remedy, that you can draw districts in a way where you will allow that community of interest to be a majority minority, that community, that protected class, to be a majority minority of a new district. And if all of those are met in federal law, at-large elections are actually not legal in under Federal Voting Rights Act. The challenge is that under the Federal Voting Rights Act, it was always very hard to bring up cases, and there were significant costs that the attorneys could never really have any confidence they would ever recover. So the California Voting Rights Act changes that definition of racially polarized voting. Doesn't have to have that same outcome. It doesn't have to result in the idea of a majority minority district. Under the California Voting Rights Act, you can be required to convert and create districts where that protected class can have a quote unquote ability to influence the outcome of an election. And state laws never said that's 37% or 17%. It's really just a judgment. I think that's been frustrating for a lot of agencies, where there isn't somebody saying, here's a mathematical formula you need to follow to define whether or not you have the ability to create districts where a community can influence the outcome of an election, and that it's just kind of an open question. The other thing, like I mentioned in the CVRA, they require repayment to the plaintiffs if the district ends up converting and finding that they were in violation of the California Voting Rights Act and hadn't changed on their own. The recent law has limited the amount of attorney's fees to roughly $30,000 adjusted for inflation if an agency follows certain set criteria in the process. The most critical criteria in this, and the openness and transparency, is the scheduling out of public hearings, having 5 hearings, 2 hearings initially just about the process but no maps, then 2 hearings on draft maps, where every time you have a hearing on a map, you're only discussing maps that have been public for 7 days on the district's website, and then a final vote. And that final vote is an up or down vote on a final plan with no changes to the map. So it's a kind of situation where you have your 5th hearing and you can't walk in and say, oh, here's our, my cousin Bob drew this new map and this is what I want to pass. The fact is that you can only pass a map that's been public for 7 days, and it ensures that the public understands the process that you're going through. The districting of the creating of election districts within a school district determine who can run for an office. They have to live in that district, and who votes in that office. It's the residents of that area. You can think of it as districts, they matter on election day or in California election month. So that's really what they do determine. What they don't necessarily determine is how you govern and how you see yourself as a school board. Are you concerning yourself with the issues of the entire agency? That is really determined by the agency and the board and it meets. And it's kind of like a cultural issue. And in fact, when people bring this up, they say, well, if we go to districts where you're just going to be a bunch of little fiefdoms. I've actually seen at-large election structures where they had trustees who got elected and felt that their only constituency was this one group that was either where they were from or who they really cared about. And so you can have those kind of fiefdom things even in an at-large system. And then I've seen districted elections where the board or city council work together as a group. There are instances where, like in the city where I live, when you go to meet a city council member, on their door, it lists the neighborhoods they represent. That I feel is not what is required of the law. It's not that, and that is the way that the city I live in actually reinforces the idea of each district being their own little fiefdom, as opposed to having, you know, the sign at the door saying, I represent the whole city. So the districting system does not mean that you're needing to change your governance structure or how you view your jobs as a school board member. Now, if you're already in districts, the process is redistricting. You will find, even if you're converting from a California Voting Rights Act from a at-large to districts, most people in lay terms are just going to continue to call it redistricting, but really, obviously, redistricting is when you are redoing the process. And you have to redo this process every 10 years based on the release of the US Census. The redistricting process has been subject to more court decisions than any other area of elections law and potentially any other area of civil rights law in the recent past few decades. When we think about redistricting, when students in your districts are learning about redistricting, even my daughter, who is in 5th grade, started to learn about concepts around elections and that people run in districts. But when they learn about redistricting, this is the thing that they pretty much learn universally. And when I talk to people who aren't involved in politics and I say something about redistricting, they say, oh, gerrymandering. Well, gerrymandering is, it comes from a political cartoon. You know, this is 100 years old, and it has to do with the creation of state senate districts, actually 200 years old, of state senate districts, and it was actually Governor Gary. So if you want to get into the debate, it's kind of like the GIF versus GIF debate, whether it's gerrymandering or gerrymandering, but either way, it's seen as an old-timey thing, and a lot of people think, well, that was the past. They don't do that anymore. But of course, this is a state senate district in California as it was drawn in 2001, and to me, that looks like the original gerrymander. That's not to say that this district was bad, but when you look at this district, the head of that district is in South Pasadena, San Marino. The feet of that district are in downtown LA. So not exactly what I would consider the normal pairing of two different communities of interest that have shared values and shared needs. It seems more like it's a way to gerrymander. So that is one of this district and other districts like this are one of the reasons why the State Redistricting Commission was created, to eliminate the ability for legislators to draw their own lines in ways like this that kind of fail to meet any kind of logical test. If you have students who are in an AP government class, they might get a little bit deeper into redistricting, and there's this fun exercise that comes up in textbooks, and it looks something like this. It's an area with a fictional, 4 green triangles and 5 yellow triangles. And if a student is given 5 seconds to draw 3 districts, they'll probably draw something that looks like this, either horizontal or vertical lines. And in either case, the yellow is going to elect 2 representatives and the green is going to elect 1 representative. Now, if you had a standout student in your AP class and they really were team green, they might say, well, I drew my lines like this. And what they did was they were able to gerrymander to allow the minority to have the ability to elect the majority of representatives. This is gerrymandering, and usually seen in a political context or a racial context. But there are other ways of gerrymandering that have to do with protecting incumbents or doing other things to manipulate the process. So when you think about gerrymandering, it's good to get it out of your mind as just that it's a political thing, because that makes you think about federal government, Congress, and so on. And think about it as any way in which people are trying to manipulate the political outcomes by doing things in the line drawing process that are kind of the unnatural things in the line drawing process, where they're manipulating for some other kind of political or personal outcome. So in order to remove or lessen the ability of a process to be taken over by a gerrymander, we have some traditional redistricting criteria that are utilized around the country for all kinds of different agencies. Some are in state law, some are in federal precedents and court cases, but I'm going to go through all of these and then discuss how they fit within the actual specific state laws that you need to follow. First off, districts need to be relatively equal size. This is the idea in redistricting. The primary idea is equalizing power between different areas to make sure that they all have equal representative and political power. So when we think about this, there are actually two things that we're trying to create. We're trying to create that idea of equal representation, which is one part of constitutional law, and one person, one vote. The court has decided that in order to balance both of these, that the right metric to use is creating districts where the total population from the US Census is relatively equal. Now, we're not looking at citizens, we're not looking at adults, we're not looking at parents, we're looking at relatively equal based on total population. Now, relatively equal in local government, municipal, school board redistricting is a buffer of 10%, meaning that the biggest district and the smallest district should be within 10% of each other. Now, we've seen agencies that haven't redistricted in decades and find themselves with huge deviations. And let me illustrate one way in which that creates a potential disenfranchisement. So in one agency along the coast, it was a big community college district. They had one district that they elected a representative from that had 100,000 people in it, another district that had 12,000 people in it. So you had 100,000 person district, one 12,000 person district. What that meant was that everybody in that 12,000 person district had 8 times the voting power of somebody in a 100,000 person district. And if there was an issue, like you know, if it was a city council, it may be a pothole, but if it was a school board or community college, it might be an issue with a program or, you know, issue at the schools. The voice in that 100,000 district, you would actually have to take yourself and 7 more friends to go speak with your school board member to have the same power as one single person in the 12,000 person district. So that inequality, bringing that together and closer within a 10% deviation is seen as the goal of this equal population. Now, that 10% goal, oftentimes when we're, as human beings, when we see something like that, we say, okay, well, 10% is good, so I guess 8% would be better, or 5% would be even better, 1% would be great. And a lot of times agencies fall into this trap of thinking that they want to get to a really narrow deviation. And I'm here to tell you that that isn't really the right way to think about it. You want to balance this idea of equality with all the other criteria. And you wouldn't want to create an artificial test like we want a 1% deviation, so our districts can be better than the neighbors' districts. And in doing so, say our 1% deviation plan splits 5 neighborhoods and, you know, doesn't create that majority minority district, and it violates all these other criteria, but it's 1%, it doesn't make it better. So that should be thought of as a goal and as part of the whole process, not as a single unitary goal. Contiguous districts should be whole pieces, and this is one of those kind of criteria that on the face of it seems really obvious. Contiguous, something that's contiguous is a whole part. It doesn't have little breakaway parts. So within redistricting, though, there are two parts of a thing called functionally contiguous. Is a district that has some little island. An island could be a literal island, like Catalina Island is contiguous to LA County because that's how it's in LA County, and you get to the coastline by ferry going into San Pedro or Long Beach normally. So it's contiguous to LA County. But also in some cities, you might have a city that annexes a population far away and it's not actually contiguous to itself. And if a school board is utilizing any city boundaries, it might find itself having an agency where there's a non-contiguous part. In those cases, putting that area with the most local area, how it is functionally contiguous to the district, is the way to go. The second thing to think about is sometimes an agency like the City of Davis is split by a railway, and there's only certain places you can cross the rail line. And so you would say it's functionally contiguous if, you could say it's literally contiguous if two things were on either sides of a railway line, but maybe they're not functionally contiguous because you can't get to one from the other. So those are some concepts that will come up in redistricting. Communities of interest is a key criteria in the process. You can think of it as a couple tiers. The first tier is Voting Rights Act, protected classes, the ethnic, language, national origin, protected classes. And these are largely in California, Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. But we can find in certain agencies, like where I grew up in Glendale, that the Armenian population is one of these protected classes. And in San Diego, in some parts of inland San Diego County, you might find the Chaldean population as being one of those communities of interest. So there are others other than these three, but these are the three that are primarily used and that the census provides great data on. Now, when you're drawing districts looking at the ethnic composition, you need to do so while not making it the predominant or only criteria that you're using. And there are issues where if you have the ability to create a majority-minority district or something else, you're going to want to work with your legal counsel to make sure that you're drawing districts in an appropriate way that respects and meets the federal requirements on how districts are drawn, with the consideration of these ethnic populations, while not falling into the trap of somebody being able to say that you're drawing districts only because of the racial composition and that it wasn't required by the Voting Rights Act. Other communities of interest are more maybe the softer communities of interest, things like where the student populations are, maybe where an area of the city or the school district boundaries is more seniors or more rural or urban or downtown areas. We did a community college redistricting that always stands out in my mind, where there was a large agricultural area within the community college district. And they came forward to the community college board and said, hey, we want to make sure we have a trustee that represents us in this area because there are all these programs that are really important to us. And when all the school board members or community college board members come from the downtown area, they don't understand the needs that we have in the more rural area, the educational needs we have. So having these kinds of community interest as part of the discussion in the redistricting process is really key. Following existing boundaries, school districts probably know this in one part, but maybe might not think about it in the redistricting element, is that campuses and their service areas, the attendance areas and where the pathway between elementary, middle, and high school, a lot of these things actually have an interplay that is geographic. And so utilizing some of those boundaries, and in other cases, utilizing city boundaries or other boundaries that might be good ways for you to identify different communities of interest. And this goes both ways. You might have a school board redistricting that's looking at where the city boundaries are, and then 2 weeks later, there might be a city council redistricting looking where the school board areas are. We did a redistricting in the city of Santa Ana, and we utilized the boundaries of the Garden Grove Unified School District that spills into Santa Ana as one of the ways to help draw a city council district seat. So this interplay between existing governmental agencies can be a part of helping to figure out a kind of rational basis for why you're drawing a line in a certain place. Another criteria, the last on this kind of traditional criteria list, is keeping districts compact. Now, compact doesn't necessarily mean small. It has to do more with the shape of the area. So if you're thinking about in science, the most compact shape in science is a sphere. So the more sphere-like, square-like, the more compact something is. And there are a ton of metrics around compactness and mathematical formulas and different research papers, making it really crazy in terms of trying to calculate compactness. There's also cases where they define compactness as something as simple as outlawing funny shapes. So literally, I'm trying to think if it's Idaho, it might be Idaho, I think, that has a language in their state law that says districts can't be drawn as funny shapes. And that's, you know, I think kind of up to the eye of whoever's drawing those lines probably. But in California, we don't use these kind of definitions. It's important to know that they're there, but in California, we utilize another new definition. And since it's a new definition, we're really going to see how it's used and interpreted in our processes around the state. The definition we have in California is that in drawing districts, you should not bypass nearby populations to go get a more distant population. So it takes a second for that to kind of settle in, to think about it. I'm going to show some examples that I think really illustrate it, but you don't want to bypass a nearby population to go get another far away population. So here's a couple examples of how that looks. And in fact, these examples are examples that were being looked at when the legislation, the Fair Maps Act, was drawn, and when this definition became the primary definition for compactness in California. So here's a district. This is actually a city council. I'll allow that to be an anonymous city unless somebody's got really good eyes and can read the map. But we have in this city a area A in this southeastern corner that is a community. I've actually spent some time there. And then you have B and C around it. These are other nearby communities. So if you were in A, you would probably go shopping at a grocery store in B, or maybe your kids go to school in the area C. But this is all a community. It's all on one side of the freeway. This is all kind of like a little bit a set of nearby communities. I think it's undeniable that these are little nearby communities. Now there's this area D, way out on the other side of the freeway. And what they did in this instance is what they looked at A and D, and instead of drawing A with other nearby communities, they kind of danced it up this way, crossed the freeway at a place that has no population. In fact, the construction area was there recently that you couldn't even cross there, and then go out here all the way to D. So this is under the law as this plan was passed, it was legal, but under the new definitions in state law, this would not be considered by me and anybody I've ever talked to about it as meeting the criteria of not bypassing nearby populations in favor of a further away population. Let's look at another example. This is another city, and I'll do it a little quicker because we've got this area A here on the east side again. And this city redistricting looked at that area B over there, and instead of drawing A with population nearby, it kind of danced all the way through and across to get to this area B. That clearly seems to me like violating the principle of avoiding, not avoiding nearby population for further away population. And in addition to that, this area B probably violates that earlier criteria of keeping communities of interest together, keeping neighborhoods or kind of the geographic area of a district together. So those kind of redistrictings are the kinds of redistrictings that have been outlawed in state law through the use of this new compactness definition. It's also really important to understand redistricting is a much more public process. How the redistricting is seen by members of your community, by the media, and maybe even more importantly, how it's seen by attorneys in your area can help define whether or not your redistricting will be seen as a success or not. That first example, the Sacramento Bee, called that praying mantis and had some colorful language to describe in an editorial what they thought of that redistricting. In the second example, it wasn't just the editor of the Sacramento Bee complaining, it was a judge who decried that it was a parody of the original gerrymander. And both of these redistrictings did hold up to challenges, but that was before the law was changed. And in part, the law was changed because of these two redistrictings. So starting in 2020 to go into how these criteria fall into current state law, the process that we have in California is driven a lot by the process that has been established for cities and counties. So cities and counties are under the Fair Maps Act. And like so much in redistricting, the criteria trickle down. So in fact, if we were drawing a water districts in California have almost no rules. They're not even told that they have to follow the Federal Voting Rights Act, but they do. They're not told they have to do a 10% deviation, but they do. There's a lot of the processes of redistricting that relies on what are best practices, what are the things that are commonly being done in other similar agencies. And so the Fair Maps Act creates these best practices that are around additional transparency, not using incumbency or candidates as a community of interest, not drawing districts to advantage political party. They require specific additional outreach to try to engage the public. They require a opportunity for people to receive information in different languages. They require agencies to have a separate website up on their, or separate page on their website for information about the redistricting with links to agendas and presentations and videos of hearings. And it also requires, this is a real easy one to do, but it's a very important one, that redistricting hearings are time certain. So what that means is if the redistricting is item 11 on an agenda, in the past, I would go and sit through 2 hours of school board meeting until that item came up, and anybody from the public would have to sit through all of that before the redistricting item came up. And they might not know, is the redistricting item coming up at 5 or 7 or 9 o'clock at night? And I've even been involved in one that didn't start until around 11:30 at night. The state law now says you need to have that be a time certain. So it might be agenda item 11, but it'll say this hearing is going to go at 7:30. Or a lot of agencies already are planning on having their redistricting being a standalone like hearing that happens before the actual board meeting. So you might have like a call it a workshop hearing or something like that. There's also a push to have agencies, if they have their meetings, always, it's not so much for school boards, but for a lot of special districts, if they have meetings, or county supervisors, if they have meetings at 9 a.m. or 11 a.m. on Tuesdays, that at least one of their hearings is in the evening or a weekend. Additionally, one of the things that we're seeing a lot more of in trying to meet this transparency and openness is a use of online tools that aren't required, but are becoming a norm. And so the tools that we like to use are those like maps where people do hand-drawn maps at big workshops, at school board, in a school board hearing, or at a senior center, or some other place where people can gather in big groups and draw maps. That, unfortunately, is not something we're expecting to be doing this year. But in lieu of that, these online tools are becoming much more prevalent. And I understand that in the past, these were really hard to learn, try to figure it out. It was challenging. The software's gotten better, and our aptitude for logging online and doing something like this has gotten better. If you had told me a year ago, or you guess I was told a year ago, that I have to get on Zoom to have my daughter and my mom get on a meeting together so she could see her grandma, I'd think you were crazy. But now it's happening all the time. And same thing with these online mapping tools. The online mapping tools might have seemed like a huge problem to try to get people to start using 10 years ago, but now it seems like people are going to be adapting to those a lot quicker. These online mapping tools can be for people to draw their community of interest, or for them to propose maps or respond to maps that have been drawn. Some timeline things, and then I think we'll go into some questions. If you're an agency that has primaries, your deadline is mid-December. If you're an agency that doesn't have primaries and only has a general election, the deadline is mid-April. These deadlines are going to be changing, I would expect, because of the late census data. The time frame for these hearings and how they should kind of pencil out would be in a CVRA redistricting, you have to have 5 hearings, 2 pre-map, 2 post-map, and 1 final adoption. The 2 post-map hearings, when you have draft maps, those maps have to be public for 7 days. or you can't discuss the maps. So if you are having a hearing and there's a new map that you want to discuss, then you have to agendize it for the next hearing, or talk about it within the context of a map that you already have posted for 7 days. The redistricting can use a little bit shorter time frame, but probably wants to follow the same type of pattern. Early hearing on the process without maps drawn yet, so the community understands that you're here to listen to them. When you do have draft maps, having a hearing, but having those maps posted for 7 days beforehand. Have a third hearing, at least a third hearing, where you have a map that's been posted for 7 days, and you can either adopt that plan or make any more changes. If you make changes, then you move it to a fourth hearing where you can actually pass that as an up or down vote on a plan that's been public for 7 days. You don't want to have a process where you review a map, make some changes, and then pass it immediately without having that map be public for 7 days and the public to be able to give any input. That's just not within the spirit of the law as it currently is being used. In terms of time frames, if you're in a June primary, you can be doing some of your outreach now and through the summer. That is outreach to ask the community to engage and ask them where their communities of interest are, and even set up online mapping tools. In the fall, after the census data is released, then you can start drawing draft maps and having those hearings, and then complete the process between mid-November and mid-December in order to be done in the required time frame. Working with your county also and keeping up to date with as changes in these deadlines are made as a result of the late census data. If you're in a November election, we can be a little bit more sure of what these timeframes are going to look like. The data is released September 30th. If you only have a November general election, you don't have a primary, you don't have to get engaged in this like, sitting on the edge of your seat waiting for the census data to come out, because you can say to yourself, we're going to start in January, February of 22. We're going to go through a process of reviewing the data, having an outreach hearing, releasing some draft maps, and go through all that process through March, and then be done by April 15th. And again, that deadline might change, but that deadline might stay the same. We'll find out more. The big headline in terms of other considerations is to realize that these timeframes might change. The census could be earlier, it could be later, there could be problems, we just don't know. If you're an agency that only has a November general election, some agencies will be like, well, we just want to get it over with, so we're going to do it this fall, concurrent with agencies that have June primaries. Be aware that if you do that, you might find yourself, going to the county and they'll say, well, we're not going to implement those lines until November anyway, so don't bug us until after April. I guess I should just put a banner at the top of this screen that says, be patient, wait for updates. The dated time frames might change. The filing deadline periods might change. The release of the census and when you have to be done, that window of time might narrow or might widen. There's a lot still to be known, but we'll continue to keep you updated. And with that, I think we're going to go into some questions, and I'm happy to respond to anything that folks want to ask.
Yeah, so it looks like we did receive a couple of questions here. One of the first ones that they were asking is it necessary to switch to an at-large district or switch from at-large to by trustee area district if there's an overwhelming majority of the population that is Hispanic and the board is 100% Hispanic?
So the state law doesn't create a metric like that to say, what's the composition of your board? Do you have racially polarized voting? As an example, there was a redistricting or a CVRA conversion in Escondido where the city was 1/4 Latino and one of the 4 council members was Latino. So it was 1/4 Latino on the board, 1/4 Latino of the population, and they felt that they weren't in violation of CVRA because of this relationship. I'll say that the California Voting Rights Act doesn't say that you're exempt because of that, but it's probably more likely that you're not going to have attorneys knocking at your door claiming you have racially polarized voting and claiming that the Latino population doesn't have the ability to elect a candidate of choice, but you're not immune from it. So there's nothing to stop somebody from trying to sue you. It's just that you're probably not going to be high on the target list. And this is the kind of thing that you'd want to ask your legal counsel maybe to help you understand what potential vulnerability you would have. There just simply is not something written into state law that will give you a yes or no answer on that.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. I just reiterate the fact that the CVRA does not create a per se violation just because you have an at-large voting. It's really designed to protect protected classes in their voting rights. So given this particular scenario, you are less likely to face litigation on it, but there is no statutory exemption, as Paul's pointed out.
See, there's other questions as well, Paul and Rob. Please explain, define majority, minority. It seems contradictory.
So majority minority is when a protected class is able to comprise 50% or more of an election district. Now, it is funny that in California, the plurality of the population is non-white, right? And the majority of the population is made up of other traditionally underrepresented minorities. So sometimes when people think about it in a context statewide or even in their agency, they might say, well, the majority is already, like the minority is the white population and the majority is the Latino population. When we're talking about this, we're talking about traditionally underrepresented protected classes under the Federal Voting Rights Act. So we're talking about those Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. Now, one subpart of that discussion about majority minority districts under federal law is that we think about it as this binary test of 50%. So you can draw a district that's 50%, you just wash your hands, you say, look, there it is, and we're done. There are other things that come into play because once you're drawing majority minority districts, there's this idea of, does that majority minority district actually create the remedy that you're intending? Does it allow for those candidates to elect those voters to elect a candidate of choice? And oftentimes a agency will work with their own legal counsel, maybe get a racially polarized voting analysis, maybe listen to the community like an organization like MALDEF or other groups coming forward, and they might make a decision that no, 50% of this protected class is not sufficient to create an effective majority minority district. So we need to create that district at 53% or 55%. And we have data and community of interest testimony and legal analysis that says that's actually the bar that we need to meet. So whenever you dive into these issues of majority minority, it's imperative to have your own legal counsel involved in it and to make sure that your communications around what it is you're trying to do with that majority and minority district and why are being vetted by legal counsel so that you don't find yourself unwittingly falling into some legal problem.
Okay, here's another one. For a small school district, if you are elected by one neighborhood, are you just representing the one school which happens to land in your neighborhood? And also a second part of that, what if the main high school is not in your particular neighborhood? Do you not have a say for decisions regarding schools outside of your neighborhood boundaries?
Yeah. For school boards, it really doesn't matter what election method you have. You represent the entirety of the district and all the schools within that district, regardless of how you've been elected.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to my slide earlier about the districting really just affects election day, and it should be thought of as that. And I have seen districts that go to election districts like this or cities that go to districts like this and they try to kind of make it be about the area they're from. And I've also seen that happen in at-large systems where maybe all the school board members or city council members come from the downtown area and issues of the rest of the agency aren't met as much because they're focused more on the areas that they're from. So it's important always, as Robert said, for the agency representatives to represent the entirety of the district.
Got it. Another one, districts that are already split up in districts/areas, should they be looking at the Census 2020 results to see if the changes need to be made?
Yeah, so agencies should look at the data to see how much their population has changed in each district and see if the population change is outside of that 10% acceptable range. But that's not the only thing to look at. Oftentimes they could be within that range, but also maybe the growth of the Latino population or the growth of the Asian population or the shifting of the African American population creates a change in the communities of interest that would play into the districting process. So cities and counties are required to do this process every 10 years under the Fair Maps Act with all the hearings and all the accoutrements of the redistricting process. And the same thing's true with school boards. You're required to engage in this process, and you might, if you've had a lot of change, end up having more hearings, more engagement. If you've had less change, you might do it just in those 3 hearings, and you might even adopt the exact same lines that you have now, but it's best that you actually go through the process.
Okay. It's contained in the education code specifically for school boards, so you do need to definitely make sure you're doing this after the census data comes out.
There's several questions. There's another one. Is it legal to discuss redistricting in closed sessions?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I guess that depends on where you're at in the process. If somebody has initiated a lawsuit against you under the CVRA, then yes, this would be covered under the Brown Act as ongoing litigation. If you haven't gotten to that point, it's not going to be protected as a closed session item.
And even with the CVRA, the closed session stuff would be separate from the 5 hearings and all that public part of the process.
Correct. Good point.
There's another one. For the redistricting, do you recommend a certain number of draft maps to be created for consideration at the initial hearing?
It's standard to do 3. You can do more. And it's important to note that sometimes if you're doing a real robust outreach and engage with the community, you might do no draft maps. You might instead elevate maps that the public has drawn and said, okay, this group map that was created, we want to consider that as our draft plan, or these 2 or 3 maps. So we've actually been in situations, most recently in City of Napa and Davis, where the final map approved wasn't a draft map that the staff created or the city council members created, but it was a draft map that was made by a member of the public that the school board or the city councils in those examples elevated and said, this draft map, that's going to be our first draft of our plan, and we're going to bring that to the next hearing, post it for 7 days, and have that be the map that we go forward with.
Got it. For districts that already have a trustee areas and there's only one minor change in population since last redistricting, can the process be expedited, or does it require all steps for reaffirming the same or nearly same boundaries?
It does require the process. It's just that you could do it, say in 3 hearings or something like that without having as much work having to be done if your district has had minimal changes, but you still are required to do the process.
Our county registrar informed us that our maps are due in February 2022 for the June 2022 election of our board members. That seems to differ from the outline you reviewed. Will the deadlines differ by county?
There are different agencies setting different deadlines. So the county has a deadline that has to do with the process of time, the amount of time it takes for them to convert your district boundaries to their precinct files and know who's running for what office. For the June primary, I would think most agencies need to have that data in earlier in December under current law, because there's a signatures in lieu of filing fee that actually starts on December 16th under the current deadlines. Those deadlines might be shifting. We do know that the California State Redistricting Commission now has until February 15th, at least presently has until February 15th. So that might be where that date comes from. A county registrar might say, well, We know we're not getting the statewide redistricting until February 15th, so it's probably going to be fine for other agencies to submit it at that time too. There's probably still things that are going to need to happen with regards to things like filing deadlines, potentially shifting the primary and other changes that really makes all those pieces fit. So when you're coming up with when you're going to be finished, you want to be looking at state law and county filing deadlines. And in some cases, a school district might overlap multiple counties, or an agency might overlap multiple counties and have to meet multiple deadlines.
I've heard that the challenging agency or attorney gets a fee up front. Is that correct?
Not in my experience. Robert, do you have experience with that?
No, the fees, so fees are based on what a lodestar method. Basically, they're looking at amount of time put in and a reasonable rate based on the attorney's experience and the complication of the case. So typically it's going to be hours billed at the end. If you follow the safe harbor guidelines, you're going to limit that liability to $30,000. If you don't follow that, you could be exposed to literally millions of dollars in legal fees. I know, I think it was Santa Monica, right, that ended up with well over $5 million in legal fees. I think
12
it's
million in counting.
Wow, yeah, it's going up and up. So I mean, the rate is somewhat set by the courts, but it's not at all unreasonable to see hourly rates of $500 or more for these kind of cases. So
if your district just went districts, what does it say? If your district just went districts 8 years ago, will they have to redistrict as well?
Yeah, there are agencies that went to districts last year and have to redistrict right now. Absolutely.
yep, the triggers that census data coming out every 10 years.
Please discuss grandfathering of existing trustees.
So that seems to be asking utilizing the existing trustees as the criteria for drawing lines to make sure that none of the trustees. I guess there's two ways of determining that. One is that could be a question that says, how much can you consider incumbents when you draw districts? And the state law under the Fair Maps Act says to not use them as a community of interest. So that would be the best practice in a districting. The second way that this could be interpreted is if you draw a district, and let's say that Robert is elected in his district in 2020, but the lines change in 22, so he's actually no longer in the district that he was elected to. He does not leave the school board. He stays on the school board because he was elected under the last iteration of lines to a district, even though he doesn't currently live in the district as it's being redrawn. The way to think about this is that district boundaries for a school board, city council, or the state senate and the legislature, they're unique in that they're 4-year terms and they have elections every 2 years in alternating patterns, right? And so when you're elected in 2020, the area you're elected to, it's going to get redrawn in redistricting, but it actually doesn't take effect until 2024. So you can think of school district redistricting with, say, 5 seats. 2 seats are going to be affected in 2022. That's when those lines get implemented. The other 3 seats, they're going to be having their elections in 2024. That's when those districts get implemented. And that staggering of it means that nobody loses their elected position because they aren't in the district as it's going to be utilized in the future. So the incumbents would essentially be grandfathered in and stay in their seats until that seat becomes open again or as their term expires naturally.
Yeah, the Attorney General's office has issued some opinions regarding residency and making sure that you reside within your trustee area for the term of your office, but that doesn't really apply in these situations. As Paul's pointed out, Ed Code really makes it pretty clear as well for school boards that the incumbent will carry out their term until the next election, even if there's a redrawing of trustee areas.
And one thing that has come up before, which is unique, is that if, let's say, somebody retires from the seat, the re-election actually happens in the old district lines because the new lines haven't been implemented for that agency yet. So that old district exists until the election in which it is utilizing new boundaries.
My district did a redistricting exercise in 2019, but obviously needs to revisit its boundaries again this year. At the time of deliberations, the board president stated that trustees should not touch or propose boundaries because of the special interest, and that only a third-party demographer should propose boundaries to avoid biases. Does this sound reasonable to you? I thought the outcome divided community of interest.
Yeah, so I think that that is a choice that a lot of agencies make. They make that choice in different ways. One way some agencies might make that choice is they might, like I said earlier, instead of drawing draft plans, they elevate a plan that was drawn by the public and they make that their draft plan. The other way would be to give to their demographer some criteria. So they say, hey, we want to make our districts that are equal size, compact, and we want to make sure that we want to make sure we follow the Federal Voting Rights Act, but we also want to make sure that we follow, existing city boundaries and existing geography like the freeways and the river, and we want to utilize those criteria. And you say to the demographer, go draw 3 draft plans. And then those come back to the board and they can start to, analyze those plans, come up with, community input and feedback on the plans, and ultimately pass the plans. It's actually rare nowadays to have a situation where a city council or school board, community college, or supervisors come to a meeting and say, okay, Sally on the council wants this line, and Bob on this community college board wants this district, and that they're comprised by the actual elected officials drawing their own seats. It's usually more about the elected officials defining criteria and either allowing their demographers or having the public assist in the line drawing.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the cost of that, right, compared to the potential for liability, it's important to factor that in and hire professionals and experts in this area who can help you avoid potentially really expensive litigation on this. So
let's see, there's another one here. Any recommendations you would like to give for districts that are considering reducing from 7 to 5 seats during the redistricting process?
So there is the ability to adjust the number of seats that you have when you're converting into the California Voting Rights Act from an at-large to districted systems. But if you're already in a districted system with 5 or 7 trustees or whatever number, I'll defer to Robert on how this would work at a school district, but generally it's something that would have to go to the county Office of Education, and isn't as simple a process as just a board passing an ordinance. Robert, do you want to?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's in the Ed Code. I think it's section 5019, the same thing that gives you the authority to select methods. There is the ability to reduce your trustee or enlarge your trustee areas, but it is a little bit more complicated process. And if you like, you can reach out to us separately and we can talk to you a little bit more about that in detail.
When a district approves a resolution to redistrict, isn't it required to hold public hearings within 90 days? If the district does not, then does this constitute a violation of CVRA? One district did this, it's resolution 2016, and the date has done nothing.
So actually right now, because the census data was coming out in 2021 and agencies were needing to go to convert districts but not wanting to do it before the census data was released, they actually allowed, you're not having to follow those 90-day timelines right now. It used to be 90 days or a total of 180 days for the process. The challenge was that if you were to, say, sue a district today, you'd be requiring them to still use this 2010 data because the 2020 data isn't out yet. You'd be requiring them to effectively draw what we call a zombie plan. A zombie plan is a set of district lines that is never going to be used in an election. There have been agencies, there was a water district in the Sacramento area that drew a zombie plan. They passed a plan, they adopted it, and they knew it was never going to actually be used because they were going to have to redo the entire process for the 2022 election. So the executive orders around the time of COVID and recent changes in the law allows for agencies to have the process go under a normal time frame post-census data release in September and through the same, essentially the same time frame as a redistricting.
Also, so under new laws, we all have to move the trustee area systems. Our district is about 4 square miles and demographics change very little across the area. Are we still required to create trustee areas?
As Robert mentioned, there's no exemption for small agencies. And so it doesn't say that you don't have to. And there are some very small, the city of Bradbury is the smallest city in the state that actually has districts. And I think in some cases, each of their districts might have 130 people voting in an election. So some districts can be kind of small. Robert, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's challenging, right? Like there is no per se violation because you have an at-large voting method. It certainly exposes you to potential liability, especially with CVRA and the way that it's set up. And for really small communities, right, dividing into districts can make it hard to get enough people to run for office, right? If you only have a community of 1,000 people and you've divided up your districts, you may find it a little bit more difficult to get candidates to run from each district. But there is no per se requirement that you make this change. It's just something you really ought to think about to avoid the potential expenses.
One fact of this is that if you're in a really, really small district, it can sometimes be impossible for the traditional methods of measuring racially polarized voting to be effective. And so in some cases, agency that's that small won't actually be targeted by attorneys because the attorneys can't themselves find a demographer or racially polarized voting expert that will tell them there's racially polarized voting there. So racially polarized voting analysis requires lots of data, many, many precincts, and the ability to look at elections historically. And if you're an agency that has 4 precincts, it's hard to prove racially polarized voting.
Yeah, and I've mentioned a couple times about the cost. It's also really important to remember the reason behind the CVRA, right, and the Federal Voting Rights Act is to make sure that we have more inclusive voting systems and a better representation of our actual communities. So there's a lot to go into this in terms of your decision making as to whether or not you're going from at large to a trustee area. And again, I think it's really worth talking with professionals about that when this is at your doorstep before you end up getting hit with one of these letters asking you to change over at someone else's will instead of yours.
We got time for a couple more here. Here's another one. Can you limit voting to only those votes who reside in at-large elections or votes have input into the board every 2 years? The districts you have identified, voting would only happen once every 4 years. Can you have fewer areas overlapping trustee terms to address this?
I think what they're talking about is the idea, it would be multi-member districts where you have an election in an area every 2 years, but you elect one trustee 1 year and the other trustee another year. That's not allowed under the current California Voting Rights Act. It would be considered an at-large election system.
El Monte has never had an Asian candidate, nor mayor, nor city council member. The population at Zion increased greatly with Asians. Is El Monte right for CVRA?
Well, you would want to bring in a demographer, bring in your legal counsel. I'll give an example though. City of Santa Ana, where we did a CVRA conversion, they had those types of elections where you had to live in an area, but they elected at large. They had an all Latino city council for a long, long time. And they were sued by the Vietnamese community who were largely in the city of Santa Ana on the Garden Grove side. There was Garden Grove School District overlapping the city of Santa Ana. And that was when I gave the example of a city looking at school district boundaries for the creation of their own district lines. That was an example out of Santa Ana. They were sued by the Asian community to create a district that could give Asians the ability to elect a candidate of choice. So I definitely know El Monte. I know some of the elected officials down there, but without speaking to the exact data and having it in front of me, I would say that that's the kind of situation where you might want to take a closer look and talk to your legal counsel.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect example of why we have these requirements to review every 10 years, right? As populations shift, voting trends shift, and that's exactly why we have these laws in place.
If the voting was at large and then redistricting happens, how does the next election run? If I was just elected last year, but we go to districts, how is the next election decided for which district?
The board actually gets to determine that. So when you're drawing districts, every plan that is put out as a draft plan will have a proposed election district numbering and what years those seats would be up. So the board would be able to determine when they pass a plan both the boundaries and which seats are going to be up which time. And in that part of the process, you can kind of reintroduce that idea of where do the incumbents live and how do we make sure that we're not like purposefully drawing somebody's seats so that they're up in 22 and we're going to do like some gotcha thing and put their seat up in 2024. So that part of the process can be done kind of eyes wide open and in order to try to reduce the impact on the currently elected officials. But sometimes there are instances where you end up doing that, and because of a district that doesn't have a seat for each incumbent, you might have two people in an area where that election is going to come up in 2024, and one of the incumbents is termed out in 22, the other incumbent's termed out in 24, and that's just going to have to be part of that transition process.
Can a district draw areas to protect present board member seats? Are they drawn around high schools only?
So the second question, they're not drawn around high schools only. They can be drawn around a number of different criteria. The high schools or having a school in each district can be kind of under the other criteria that a district might want to choose to use, but they're not required. And the use of incumbents as a community of interest is something that the Fair Maps Act disallows, and so it becomes a best practice for school districts to not do what we did decades ago, where a redistricting wouldn't even start until somebody got the addresses of all the incumbents and made sure that new lines could be drawn that would preserve the incumbents. Right now, that's just not how redistricting is done. It's not a best practice, and so it's something that we would discourage from utilizing as a community of interest.
Yeah, I don't think it's one of those community interest factors that you want to really consider, right? Given especially fair maps access, it's not an option. One of the things that I like to do as the demographer when I go into an agency is I say, I don't want to know where the incumbents live. We'll draw maps. School board members are not blind. They might know what district they're going to be in. They might know the implications of different draft maps. And if there are 3 draft maps and 2 of them are maps where the incumbents feel like they, can run for re-election, then that might be which map gets the most votes. But it's important that the process creates maps that meet the rational criteria and are fair and open and done in a public process.
Does the LA County Commission on School District Does the LA County Commission on School District reorganization have the final say?
So it used to be that they would have the final say in CVRA conversions. Traditionally, they're not anymore, but it might be county by county. And Robert, do you have any feedback or thoughts on that?
Yeah, in LA County is a little bit different. I'd have to look into that a little bit, but I don't. Typically, the school board has the right to make that choice, right? But the county district commission on redistricting does have some say in it. So,
and the community colleges used to fall into this part as well. And I remember in 2011 we did have a community college where the committee on school district reorganization tried to pull that districting into one of their meetings for them to have approval. And as I recall, it was determined that they didn't have that authority anymore.
With declining enrollment, can a joint unified district, 6,500 students, city population of 34,000, combine returning to the pre-joint unified number of trustees, 5, and redistricting to vote by trustee areas?
Sounds like a Robert question.
I'm going to have to hear that one again.
Okay. With a declining enrollment, can a joint unified district, 6,500 students, city population of 34,000, combine returning to the pre-joint unified number of trustees, which is 5, and redistricting to vote by trustee areas?
So can you reduce your number of trustees and move to trustee area voting? Yes, you can. You can do that, and you would go through the same process that we've been talking about here with converting to trustee areas into the CVRA. if I understood the question correctly.
I'm interested in an independent redistricting commission. Is that considered a best practice? How do we make that happen?
So the use of independent redistricting commissions is allowed in cities and counties where the Fair Maps Act allows them to actually hand off to a third-party group the authority to pass a final plan, and then they utilize a process of selecting commissioners that is also independent, where like a city clerk or a judge or somebody else actually identifies members of the community that serve on that commission and will pass the lines. School districts, water districts, community colleges don't fall under that, so there isn't right now a set of code, like a code section that allows them to essentially hand off that authority to a third party, which is effectively what you're doing when you're creating an independent commission. There is a bill that I haven't spent a lot of time looking at in the legislature right now that would pass a lot of the Fair Maps Act elements down to other agencies, but the secondary challenge is literally just a timing thing. The agencies that have gone to independent redistricting commissions and done it well, like City of Long Beach, where we're the demographer, we're also doing Berkeley and Oakland that have these types of independent redistricting commissions. They had undergone a more than year-long process of identifying potential commissioners, having an application process, having a review process, having interviews and different ways of identifying that both they're getting high quality commissioners and also that they're getting a broad diversity of skill sets among those commissioners and broad diversity of ethnic, gender, and also in some cases sexual orientation among the different commissioners, in order to make sure that the commission is as diverse as the city or county itself. Agencies trying to go and push right now to go to an independent commission might not have the time to be able to do that, even if the law did allow for it. So I think for this election cycle, unless something dramatic happens at the state legislature, for this redistricting cycle, agencies are going to still be in the process of doing the work themselves.
All right. Is it better to have multiple schools on an area borderlines, or better that schools be wholly in an area? I think they're wanting to say is one. My district has nearly 50% of schools on area borders. They seem to have done it on purpose. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I've seen situations where they would do something like that. And the idea being that we want each of the trustees or school board members to feel like they really are invested in many schools because they have many areas, the attendance areas overlapping their election district. That is what I would consider kind of a lower ranking criteria. The higher ranking criteria would be that they're equal population, compact, and that they respect communities of interest. So if you were to say do that and it fit all the other criteria, that's great. But if you were to do that, and in order to do that, you had to take the downtown area and split it into 5 different districts. And you had to take this heavily Latino area and split it into 3 different districts. And you had to take this, make a district that was all this weird shapes in order to achieve it. Then it probably wouldn't be something that could be supported under the current best practices.
All right, last question. So in our small district, we need to create trustee areas, but can the voting still be at large?
Not under the California Voting Rights Act. You'd still be subject to a potential claim.
Yep.
Perfect. I just want to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially those who contributed to questions. CSBA is dedicated to providing up-to-date resources to school board members. To view our recent webinars, be sure to check out our YouTube page at youtube.com/CSBA video. If you're interested in attending future CSBA webinars, please go to our website at www.csba.org/webinars. Today's recording and slide deck will be available to view on our webinars page by tomorrow afternoon. Many thanks to our presenters, Paul Mitchell and Robert Terrick. With that, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.